knowledge of industrial espionage, or someone married to one of the industry's most powerful figures. But the documents revealed something even more disturbing than evidence of sabotage. Several of the papers contained correspondence between someone identified only as EV and another person referred to as EH. The tone of these letters was conspiratorial and urgent, discussing plans to expose the circle and bring justice for father. The handwriting of the EV correspondent matched samples of Evangeline's writing that Crawford had obtained from the Vandemark household, while the EH letters were written in a masculine hand that suggested they came from someone with legal or academic training. More disturbing still was Crawford's discovery that the explosion at Consolidated Steelworks was not an isolated incident. Over the past 18 months, 7 different steel mills, coal mines, and manufacturing facilities throughout Pennsylvania had suffered mysterious accidents, fires, or explosions. In each case, the damaged facility was either owned by one of Cornelius Vandemark's competitors or had been targeted for acquisition by Vandemark's rapidly expanding business empire. The pattern of these incidents was so consistent that Crawford began to suspect they were part of a coordinated campaign of industrial terrorism designed to eliminate competition and terrorize potential rivals into submission. The timing of the incidents was particularly revealing, as they always occurred during periods when the targeted companies were experiencing financial difficulties or were involved in labor disputes that made them vulnerable to acquisition by larger competitors. Crawford's investigation into these patterns led him to a shocking revelation about the true scope of the Pittsburgh Circle's activities. The organization was not simply eliminating individual competitors, but was systematically restructuring Pennsylvania's entire industrial economy to ensure their complete dominance of steel production, coal mining, and related industries. They had created what amounted to a shadow government of industrial leaders who controlled not just their own enterprises, but also key politicians, judges, police officials, and newspaper editors throughout the region. The detectives' research revealed that the Pittsburgh Circle had been operating for at least 15 years, beginning as an informal alliance between 3 major steel producers who had recognized the advantages of coordinating their efforts to eliminate smaller competitors. Over time, the organization had grown to include coal mine owners, railroad executives, banking officials, and even prominent lawyers and politicians who provided legal protection and political cover for the group's increasingly violent activities. What made the Pittsburgh Circle particularly dangerous was their sophisticated understanding of how to manipulate both public opinion and law enforcement. They owned several newspapers throughout Pennsylvania and Ohio, allowing them to control how industrial accidents were reported and investigated. They had cultivated relationships with key figures in local and state government, ensuring that investigations into their activities would be limited in scope and quickly closed without meaningful findings. Most importantly, they had developed a network of operatives, former soldiers, private detectives, and hired killers who could carry out their orders while leaving no traceable connections to the Circle's leadership. Crawford's investigation into Evangeline's family history revealed that her father, Harrison Hartwell, had stumbled upon evidence of the Pittsburgh Circle's activities while investigating irregularities in steel industry investments for his Boston banking clients. Harrison had been preparing to expose the conspiracy when he was murdered in his office, with his death staged to look like suicide. The same fate had apparently been planned for Edmund Hartwell, but the young attorney had managed to escape Boston before the Circle's operatives could eliminate him. The detective's private notes from this period reveal his growing understanding that Evangeline had somehow learned about her family's true fate and had been conducting her own investigation into the Pittsburgh Circle from within her marriage to one of its founding members. The mysterious late-night visitors to the Vandemark mansion were likely co-conspirators in this investigation, possibly including her brother Edmund, who may have been working with a small group of reformist journalists and honest law enforcement officials to gather evidence against the conspiracy. But Crawford's most chilling discovery came when he traced the ownership records of several properties that had been purchased by shell companies connected to Vandemark's business interests. One of these properties was a remote farmhouse in Westmoreland County, about 30 miles southeast of Pittsburgh. The property had been purchased in 1886, shortly after Evangeline's marriage to Cornelius began showing signs of strain, and had been maintained as a private retreat away from the scrutiny of Pittsburgh's social elite. When Crawford discreetly visited the property in late April 1888, he found signs of recent habitation that suggested someone had been living there intermittently over the past several months. The farmhouse was modest but comfortable, furnished with the kind of simple elegance that suggested it was intended as a refuge rather than a primary residence. But what struck the detective as most significant was the obvious care that had been taken to make the property defensible. Heavy shutters on all windows, reinforced doors, and what appeared to be hidden passages connecting different rooms of the house. In the house's small study, Crawford discovered what appeared to have been the operational center for an extensive investigation into the Pittsburgh Circle's activities. The walls were covered with maps of Pennsylvania showing the locations of industrial accidents, newspaper clippings detailing unexplained explosions and fires, and detailed family trees connecting Pittsburgh's industrial elite. Most damning of all was a large chart that Crawford later described as a spider's web of corruption, showing how Vandemark's empire had grown through the systematic destruction of his competitors. The study also contained an extensive collection of photographs, documents, and correspondence that provided overwhelming evidence of the Pittsburgh Circle's criminal activities. There were detailed financial records showing how the organization had manipulated steel prices through coordinated production shutdowns and artificial scarcity. There were copies of correspondence between Circle members discussing specific targets for elimination and the methods to be employed. Most disturbing of all were photographs of several Circle meetings, apparently taken covertly, that showed Cornelius Vandemark and other prominent industrialists planning what could only be described as acts of terrorism against their competitors. But the farmhouse held an even more disturbing secret. In the cellar, hidden behind a false wall that Crawford discovered purely by accident when he noticed inconsistencies in the room's dimensions, was a small chamber containing dozens of additional photographs and documents. These materials provided evidence that the Pittsburgh Circle's activities extended far beyond industrial sabotage into political assassination, judicial corruption, and the systematic elimination of journalists and labor leaders who threatened their interests. Among these photographs was one that made Crawford's hands shake as he held it. The image showed the interior of the Consolidated Steelworks boiler room, with specific structural points marked in red ink and notes written in Evangeline's handwriting describing optimal placement for maximum impact. The date on the photograph was November 15, 1887, less than a month before Evangeline's disappearance and nearly 4 months before the explosion that killed 17 workers. The implications of this photograph were staggering. It suggested that Evangeline had not only discovered the Pittsburgh Circle's plans for the Consolidated Steelworks attack, but had actually participated in its planning and execution. But Crawford's careful examination of the other documents in the hidden chamber revealed a more complex and tragic truth. Evangeline had indeed been involved in planning the explosion, but not as a willing participant in the Pittsburgh Circle's campaign of terror. Additional correspondence found in the chamber revealed that Evangeline had been coerced into providing intelligence about competitor facilities under threat of harm to her missing brother Edmund. The Circle had been using Edmund's life as leverage to force Evangeline's cooperation in their sabotage operations, while simultaneously using her marriage to Cornelius to provide cover for their activities. But Evangeline had been secretly documenting everything, building a comprehensive case against the organization while appearing to cooperate with their demands. Crawford's investigation took an even darker turn when he discovered correspondence between Evangeline and a man identified only as E.H., initials that matched those of her supposedly missing brother, Edmund Hartwell. These letters, hidden in a hollowed-out book in the farmhouse library, revealed that Edmund was very much alive, but living under an assumed identity, while helping his sister gather evidence against the Pittsburgh Circle. The letters detailed a complex plan to expose the conspiracy while ensuring the safety of both siblings and other potential witnesses. But the final letter in the collection, dated December 10th, 1887, just 2 days before Evangeline's disappearance, contained a message that chilled Crawford to the bone. E. Our father's death was not suicide. C knows we have discovered the truth about the circle. They plan to eliminate both of us within days. I have hidden copies of all evidence in multiple locations. If something happens to me, remember our childhood hiding place. The truth waits there. Do not trust anyone in Pittsburgh. The corruption reaches into the highest levels of government. Trust only the contact in Chicago whose name I gave you. Time is running out. V. The letter was accompanied by a detailed map of the Vandemark estate, with specific locations marked for what appeared to be hidden caches of evidence. Most significant was a marking at the old ice house, indicating that additional documentation was concealed somewhere within that structure. Crawford realized that Evangeline's regular visits to the ice house had not been meetings with co-conspirators, but rather trips to hide evidence that would eventually expose the Pittsburgh Circle's crimes. As Crawford pieced together the full scope of Evangeline's investigation, he began to understand the true courage and determination that had driven her final months. She had discovered that her marriage was part of a conspiracy that had murdered her father and destroyed her family. But instead of fleeing or seeking protection, she had chosen to use her position as Cornelius's wife to gather evidence that could bring down the entire organization. She had been playing an incredibly dangerous game, appearing to cooperate with the Circle's demands, while secretly documenting their crimes and planning their ultimate exposure. But Crawford's investigation was about to take an even more dangerous turn. As he prepared to retrieve the evidence hidden in the Vandemark estate's ice house, he began to notice signs that his own activities were being monitored. Strange men appeared outside his boarding house at odd hours. His mail seemed to have been opened and resealed. Witnesses who had previously been willing to speak with him suddenly became evasive or claimed to have no memory of their earlier conversations. Just when Crawford thought he had begun to understand the scope of the conspiracy, his investigation was abruptly terminated. On a rainy April morning in 1888, Detective Samuel Crawford was found dead in an alley behind Pittsburgh's Central Police Station, officially ruled a heart attack brought on by excessive drinking. But Crawford's wife later testified that her husband rarely drank and had been in excellent health. More suspicious still was the fact that all of Crawford's case files related to the Vandemark investigation disappeared from the police station on the same night he died. The detective's death marked the end of any official investigation into Evangeline Vandemark's disappearance. But it also represented something far more sinister. Proof that the Pittsburgh Circle was willing to murder law enforcement officials to protect their secrets. Crawford's death sent a clear message to other honest cops and potential investigators that some cases were too dangerous to pursue, no matter how compelling the evidence might be. In the months following Detective Crawford's death, Pittsburgh's industrial elite seemed to close ranks even more tightly, creating an atmosphere of fear and suspicion that permeated every level of society. Workers in the steel mills whispered about mysterious accidents that claimed the lives of anyone who spoke too openly about safety violations or labor organizing. Journalists found that editors were suddenly unwilling to publish stories that might reflect poorly on the city's major industrial leaders. Even politicians who had previously supported labor reforms began to change their positions, often citing vague concerns about economic stability and the need to maintain Pittsburgh's competitive advantage in national markets. But beneath this surface calm, forces were stirring that would eventually bring the Pittsburgh Circle's crimes into the light. The detective's investigation, though officially terminated, had created ripples that extended far beyond Pittsburgh's borders. Crawford had corresponded with law enforcement officials in other cities, sharing information about industrial accidents and mysterious disappearances that seemed to follow similar patterns. These contacts had begun their own quiet investigations, carefully avoiding the mistakes that had cost Crawford his life. In Boston, Police Captain William O'Brien had become intrigued by Crawford's inquiries about the Hartwell family's destruction and Harrison Hartwell's alleged suicide. O'Brien was a 25-year veteran of the Boston Police Department who had always been troubled by the cursory nature of the investigation into Harrison's death. The banker had been found hanging in his office with no suicide note and no apparent motive for taking his own life. Yet the case had been closed within days, despite numerous inconsistencies in the physical evidence. O'Brien's review of the original case files revealed several details that had been overlooked or deliberately ignored by the original investigators. Harrison Hartwell's office had shown signs of a struggle, with furniture overturned and papers scattered across the floor. Yet this had been dismissed as the result of the suicide victim's final moments of desperation. More troubling was the testimony of a night watchman who claimed to have seen 3 well-dressed men leaving the building around the time Harrison's body was discovered, but whose statement had never been included in the official police report. The Boston police captain's investigation led him to attempt contact with Edmund Hartwell, who had supposedly traveled to California, but whose actual whereabouts remained unknown. O'Brien's inquiries through Western law enforcement agencies produced no trace of anyone matching Edmund's description arriving in California during the relevant time period. But they did reveal something even more intriguing. Reports of a young attorney using various aliases who had been asking questions about industrial corruption and financial manipulation in several major cities throughout the Midwest. Meanwhile, in Chicago, investigative journalist Michael Flanagan had become interested in Crawford's research into the patterns of industrial accidents throughout Pennsylvania. Flanagan worked for the Chicago Tribune and had built a reputation for exposing corporate corruption and political graft that extended throughout the Midwest's rapidly growing industrial centers. His own investigation into steel industry practices had revealed disturbing patterns that seemed to confirm Crawford's suspicions about coordinated sabotage and market manipulation. Flanagan's research had uncovered evidence of similar conspiracies operating in other industrial centers throughout the country. In Cleveland, a group of steel and shipping magnates appeared to be using methods remarkably similar to those employed by the Pittsburgh Circle. In Detroit, the emerging automobile industry showed signs of manipulation by a coalition of industrialists who seemed to coordinate their activities through secret meetings and coded correspondence. The pattern suggested that the Pittsburgh Circle was not an isolated phenomenon, but rather part of a larger network of criminal organizations that were systematically taking control of America's industrial economy. But Flanagan's most significant discovery came when he managed to make contact with the mysterious E.H., who had been corresponding with Evangeline Vandemark. Through a complex series of intermediaries and coded messages, Flanagan arranged a clandestine meeting with Edmund Hartwell, who was indeed alive and living under an assumed identity in Chicago. What Edmund revealed during that meeting would fundamentally change Flanagan's understanding of the scope and danger of the conspiracy they were attempting to expose. Edmund had been living in constant fear for his life since fleeing Boston after his father's murder. He had changed his identity multiple times, never staying in one place for more than a few weeks, and had been forced to abandon any hope of practicing law or maintaining normal social relationships. But throughout his exile, he had continued the investigation that had cost his father his life, gathering evidence about the Pittsburgh Circle and similar organizations operating throughout the country. What Edmund had discovered was far more terrifying than even Crawford had suspected. The Pittsburgh Circle was indeed part of a larger network, but the scope of this network extended into the highest levels of American business and government. Members of the conspiracy included not just industrial leaders, but also bankers, railroad executives, newspaper publishers, judges, senators, and even cabinet members in the federal government. They had created what amounted to a shadow government that controlled key aspects of American economic policy and used systematic violence to eliminate anyone who threatened their power. Edmund's evidence included detailed documentation of how this conspiracy had manipulated the panic of 1873, engineering a financial crisis that allowed them to acquire distressed assets at a fraction of their true value. They had orchestrated labor strikes and industrial violence to justify the use of federal troops against workers' organizations. They had even influenced foreign policy decisions, pushing for tariffs and trade agreements that benefited their industrial empires at the expense of American consumers and workers. But perhaps most shocking of all was Edmund's revelation about his sister's fate. Evangeline had not simply disappeared on December 12, 1887. She had been murdered by Cornelius Vandemark himself, with the assistance of other circle members, after she threatened to expose their crimes to federal authorities. But before her death, she had managed to hide comprehensive evidence of the conspiracy in multiple locations, creating what Edmund described as an insurance policy that would ensure their crimes would eventually be exposed, even if both siblings were eliminated. The evidence that Evangeline had gathered included not just documentation of specific crimes, but also detailed information about the conspiracy's organizational structure, financial operations, and future plans. She had photographed secret meetings, copied confidential correspondence, and even recorded conversations using one of the new phonograph devices that were becoming available to wealthy consumers. Most importantly, she had identified other victims of the conspiracy who might be willing to testify if they could be assured of protection from retaliation. Edmund's meeting with Flanagan took place in an abandoned warehouse on Chicago's South Side, chosen specifically because it offered multiple escape routes and could be observed for signs of surveillance. The young attorney had become expert at such precautions during his months of exile, but even his careful preparations could not entirely eliminate the risks involved in exposing such a powerful and ruthless organization. During their conversation, Edmund revealed that he and Evangeline had developed an elaborate plan to bring down the Pittsburgh Circle by simultaneously releasing evidence to law enforcement agencies, newspapers, and political leaders in multiple cities. They had recognized that the conspiracy's power was based largely on their ability to control information and eliminate threats before they could gain public attention. By coordinating a simultaneous release of evidence in dozens of locations, they hoped to prevent the conspiracy from suppressing the revelations or eliminating all the witnesses. But their plan had been discovered before it could be implemented. Cornelius had somehow learned about Evangeline's activities and had confronted her on the night of December 12th. What followed was not the civilized discussion that Evangeline had hoped for, but rather a brutal confrontation that ended with her murder and the systematic destruction of most of the evidence she had gathered. Edmund's voice shook with emotion as he described his sister's final message to him, delivered through a coded telegram that reached him just hours before her death. She had warned him that their plan had been compromised and that he should immediately implement the emergency procedures they had developed for just such a contingency. But by the time he received the message, it was already too late to save his sister, and he had been forced to choose between attempting a rescue that would likely result in both their deaths and preserving the evidence that might eventually bring their killers to justice. The journalist's meeting with Edmund was interrupted by the sound of footsteps in the warehouse corridor, followed by the unmistakable click of revolvers being cocked. Both men realized simultaneously that their carefully planned security measures had been insufficient to prevent discovery by the conspiracy's agents. As they prepared for what seemed likely to be their final moments, Edmund pressed a small leather portfolio into Flanagan's hands, whispering urgently that it contained the locations of Evangeline's hidden evidence caches and the names of other witnesses who might be willing to testify. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror in Pittsburgh intensifies. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries, hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next in this deadly game of cat and mouse between truth and power. What followed was a desperate chase through the darkened streets of Chicago, with Edmund and Flanagan barely escaping their pursuers through a combination of luck, local knowledge, and the help of